Hello, listeners. It's Mallory Willsea, Chief Producer of the Enrollify Network, and I want to take just a moment to tell you about another show on Enrollify that I know you'll love. Mastering the Next is a cutting edge podcast exploring the future of graduate, online, and non traditional education through the lens of technology and artificial intelligence. Staying competitive in the world of graduate student recruitment and enrollment means keeping up with the ever evolving tech trends in higher ed. Join Dr. Ray Lutsky, VP of Strategic Partnerships at Element 451, as he explores what's next at the dynamic intersection of student recruitment and leading edge technology. Each episode will explore future trends and the technologies shaping the academic landscape of the 21st century. Listeners will be equipped with strategies to meet the evolving needs of today's online and non traditional learners. New episodes drop every other Friday, and you can subscribe to the show by visiting podcast.enrollify.org or just search Mastering the Next wherever you get your podcasts.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait!
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to Navigating International Recruitment, a special 5-part Pulse Check series where we dive deep into the ever-changing currents of global student recruitment and support. I'm your host, Kin Sejpal at the University of Redlands, and I'm thrilled to be your guide through this journey that is also very deeply personal to me. There is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to attracting and supporting international students. Each country, continent, and culture presents its own unique set of circumstances. In the next few episodes, my hope is to bring in expertise who will help uncover innovative strategies and best practices that will empower you to not only attract international students, but also to create an inclusive and supportive environment where they can thrive. Join me as we embark on this journey together, exploring the boundless opportunities that international education offers. Welcome, Clay, and I'm so excited to have you kick off our Navigating International Recruitment and Marketing series on the Enrollify network. I know you worked in this space for a long, long time, and you know all that there is to know about this massive topic. And I know there's only so much time we have today, but we'll do our best to at least touch on the key trends in international education. So thank
Thank
you
you for
again for
having
making
me.
time.
You flatter me, but if this wasn't a podcast but a video, you everyone would see my gray hair. So yes, I am seasoned and old, but I hope I can live up to your gracious introduction.
Wonderful. I mean, as somebody who colors her gray hair, I always say this is just experience coming through, which I shouldn't have to hide, but I have those moments. So tell us about your experience and expertise. I mean, you do have a wealth of knowledge and you worked at a few organizations, you're doing some consulting work now. So let's set you up for that and let's acquaint our listeners about your background.
I worked for the College Board, so a not-for-profit organization with a global reach, led their international higher ed initiatives, but also worked on the K-12 side as well, managing several State Department grants, and then left during COVID and have since worked for a number of organizations, currently working with the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, helping Angel Perez and his team with their international engagement strategy. Also work with the IB, the International Baccalaureate Organization, and Cambridge International, which many folks know for AS level, IGCSE, A level coursework and examinations. There's also a group in Singapore I work with closely, CALPHA, which is a college planning platform. So that's what I currently do. And the theme or the thread among all of them is helping higher ed find right match qualified students internationally.
Wonderful. Yes. NACAC is one of the organizations I know a lot of our listeners belong to, especially those who work in admissions and some of these global organizations. Yes, I've heard of them too. So, well, what can you tell us about the international recruitment landscape today? It looks a little different from your college board days, I would imagine.
That's correct. There has been a bit of a rebound. We suffered during the era where, well, especially since 2016, that coincided with one of the major senders, China, which, I've been here long enough that when I first started, Japan was the biggest sender by far of
Mm,
undergraduate students to the US in 2000.
interesting.
After 9/11, that subsided a bit. Japan had created capacity in their own country. Demographic shifts there, which we're seeing elsewhere now, but meant there were fewer students coming. They still and were and still are a major sender. But South Korea, for the next, say, 5 or 6 years, was the dominant sender or the biggest sender to
Mm,
the U.S.
mm-hmm.
But then around 2008, uh, 2008-9, there was a massive shift, and mainland China, they had always been a substantial sender of graduate students to the US, but it shifted to undergrad. And since 2008, they have been by far the largest sender, close, well over 100,000 undergraduate students. Now that has gone down, uh,
Right.
really starting in around 2016. Now, there are factors other than that election,
Mm,
Trump, but that was the optics around Trump's election, and then the actual policies uh, not only impacted China, but particularly there was a dip in China that's continued. And
mm,
but and COVID exacerbated that. But I hope we've seen the trough, and now we're bouncing back in the U.S.
yeah.
There has been a rebound, and at the same time, there's been a bit of a reboot of how universities approach international recruiting. And in that reinvention, there's been several factors that we can talk about more, but this is, I feel, it's an inflection point, that after COVID, after Trump, with Brexit and other policies going on, the U.S. is poised to really poised to do well and reinvent itself during this inflection point. So, would love to talk more about that.
That's why I thought this would be the right time for us to embark on this topic. Again, however big it and daunting it may seem, but we had some headwinds in the international recruitment and marketing space. Obviously you touched a little bit on that, the pandemic, the political climate not just in the US but globally. I think there were just so many changes, so many shifts in terms of policies and such. And then policies and perceptions, I would say, are two major components of what makes or breaks some of these initiatives and outreach and recruitment activities. So, well, I'm personally, for those of you who don't know, I came as an international student. Clay, I know you and I have talked about this, and I came from India, and I was at an institution with the largest Indian population, and maybe it was second to China at the time. And it always felt to me that Asian countries were really the ones that were sending most students. Now, this is some anecdote, but I've also read some data around that. And then there was a time just before the pandemic where I felt like there was some renewed interest. I don't know if it was renewed or new in parts of Africa as well. So, talk to me about some markets, and you talked about some countries like Japan and China and Korea and others. What about the other parts of the world? What are you seeing there happen, if anything? Latin America, Africa, etc.
Well, that's where you've pinpointed exactly one of the key shifts and themes or trends in international recruitment right now, especially at the undergraduate level. It's that Greater Asia has been dominant, but particularly driven by or anchored by mainland China, but other parts of East Asia, South Korea, I mentioned Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong. That cluster of countries there have been the dominant sources overall. There's been a shift in undergraduate mobility, and your home country, India, has now been driving that. Now, in
Mm.
undergraduate space, it's still much lower than China right now, less than a third of what China sends. But whereas China is starting to decline, India is definitely ascendant. And not only India, but South Asia as a whole. Nepal has long been a sender to the US, but Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, these countries are now starting also to be an engine of mobility to other destinations, but particularly the US. And one
Mm.
key difference between, say, East Asia, but particularly China, the undergraduate majors were dominated by business, econ, social sciences, whereas when you shift to the global south, but particularly South Asia, it's STEM,
Mm-hmm.
computer science in particular, engineering, other math subjects, and technology driven subjects. It's not that Chinese students don't take those subjects, and at the graduate level, they definitely do, but that's not the dominant discipline or majors. So for universities that have those majors, what also is part of that shift, and it's related, but still a bit different, is the emphasis on return on investment, on affordability, on value is
Yeah.
much more distinct in those countries I just mentioned in the global south, particularly South Asia. Again, not that East Asians or those students weren't concerned about value, but affordability didn't come to the top of the list. They were more concerned about
Mm.
things like prestige,
Right.
ranking, experience. You don't get the liberal arts in the same way in those countries, or the interdisciplinary opportunities or internship, things like that. And certainly that's also attractive, I think, to South Asian students. But really, the affordability is much more key. The employability, the return on
Mm-hmm.
investment, and that's starting to extend. ASEAN, another part of Asia, but Southeast Asia, anchored by Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
but we're seeing growth in places like Malaysia, Indonesia. We expect to see growth from Thailand, and then,
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned, sub-Saharan Africa as you go the other direction,
Mm-hmm.
driven by Nigeria, Ghana, the Gulf of Guinea, and West Africa. But we're also seeing East Africa, southern parts of Africa, and particularly those diverse parts that have an a South Asia diaspora. You're seeing those students, so it's a complex mix. In the Americas, the Southern Cone is definitely something that we're watching, and Brazil in particular. Also driven by STEM. Previous had a great collaboration with the U.S. and other countries called Science Without Borders, and that reverberated and is now sending more students. That market isn't quite as big, but we expect it to grow.
Wow. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of emerging trends to keep an eye on. And, we can dive into each of these countries separately and learn so much more about what motivates them and what are the policy implications between certain countries and US, where is the diaspora shifting and so on and so forth. But this is very interesting time. Employability and outcomes and ROI, we know that that is becoming more and more of a prevalent concern and question with domestic audiences, right? Whereas as we talk about college affordability and value of higher education, which we know exists, but we have to do a better job of sharing that across the industry and at individual institutional level. But we also have to share that story for international recruitment purposes, especially in places where people are looking to come and get an American education or an education abroad for economic mobility. They are looking for that opportunity not just to study, but to be gainfully employed and have a better quality of life. And what does that look like, from education to employment or entrepreneurship or whatever the path it is that they choose? that story continues to be more and more important internationally and globally as well.
Absolutely. And those opportunities that's provided by through education, but particularly higher education and higher ed in the US has traditionally been, um, a beacon. It's a uh, uplifted as that, entrepreneurial and innovative, interdisciplinary, all those things. Now, even with the Trump, COVID, kind of missteps, perceptions in the US are still very strong. Um,
Mm,
IDP, a organization out of Australia, releases student surveys, and their most recent one had heartening news about how the US is viewed in relation to peers. Now, some
hmm.
of this, I think, is a sort of bite and bounce, in that there's been a
Is
bump.
that a thing, the Biden bounce?
Exactly,
Has
just
an
how the US
alliterative
is
thing to it.
how the US is perceived, and also just as a decentralized system, and that is diverse and dynamic. It's not controlled by one policy, so there's been perhaps missteps by our peers, destinations like Canada, the Netherlands, the UK, all different, but each one of those, even Australia, has had a reduction in the number of student visas, or has had
Hmm.
news in the media, in the global media, that has, I think, created questions to some students and parents about whether they would be welcome in those destinations. Now, I feel like those destinations will still be welcoming. There'll still be great competition for the US, but I think it has placed the US by not having um, those a centralized policy that can restrict overall. I think there are still perceptions that students can come here, they can get visas here. There might not, there's things that we lack. We don't have a dual purpose visa. We don't have an efficient means articulated between the F1, the student undergraduate visa, which is an exchange visa, to work or
Hmm.
citizenship like some of our peers. However, students perceive that if they hustle, they can find opportunity. They can maybe internship in other countries or even go back to their countries with skills and then return. Many see the US as being a strong destination, at least for now.
Hey, it's Mallory. Exciting news! I'm hosting the Engage Summit in Raleigh on June 25th and 26th, and I'd love to meet you there. Together, we'll dive into the mind of the modern student, what fires them up, how they interact, and what they expect in today's digital age, and how tools like AI help put them in the driver's seat of their education. We have some terrific speakers, including our closing keynote, New York Times bestselling author Jeff Selingo. Sessions will dig into practical ideas and innovative strategies to get your team more student centered and ready to adopt AI. And many of your favorite Enrollify hosts are presenting too, like Jamie Hunt, Jenny Lee Fowler, and Brian Gross. Use the discount code Enrollify50 for an extra $50 off your registration. Learn more and register at engage.element451.com. We can't wait to see you there.
Yeah. The hustle piece rings so true for so many students that I have the opportunity to mentor, and I invite students to, if they are listening to this, that I'm happy to talk to them about getting from that F1 to H1 kind of trajectory, because there isn't that automatic pathway. It is a hustle. I've done the hustle, my husband has done the hustle, many of my family members have done the hustle, and boy is it daunting. And we'll have another episode, which I'm foreshadowing for our listeners here, where we will talk about international student success and outcomes, because I think bringing them is one thing, but then nurturing them and supporting them through the process of education and employment, both on campus and off campus through internships and such, and then setting them up for success is also an area of opportunity. So, the The questions, again, in this space are vast and can be many, but I'm curious that with all of these emerging markets and where, and, a lot of institutions have a person or a team of people who are just like, okay, you are in charge of international enrollment. You're in charge of international lead gen, whatever it might be. How can we even start to put our arms around where do we focus and how do we engage students, especially as more and more sources of kind of building that top of the funnel, like
Right.
testing, for instance, those continue to be on the decline, which is again a domestic and an international trend. So, where do we start and how do we bring them into the fold?
Well, in that decentralized system, you have different structures of how enrollment is managed, or even if the international recruitment is even under enrollment, or if it's under global engagement, or
Right.
elsewhere. So that coordination, and just making sure that you have the resources as a university devoted, and you have the right people in place. But there's a couple of things that I think there's common ground in which all universities in the US should really be looking at. And they're the phrase that you'll probably hear often, that they need to meet international students where they are. And particularly in
Mm-hmm.
that was always the case, but
Mm-hmm.
particularly in that shift from the global north to the global south, there's new sensitivities uh, around really, being respected as a student, and honoring the local curricula and their own school settings. There's also more diversity in many of those countries in the types of schools, and the types of backgrounds, and the type of context in which they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So universities can't be everywhere, but to really focus in on where they have strength, to home in on um, the regions and areas and school types that they feel like they have the best chance to engage with, and create that sort of. I'm not a fan of the word pipeline, because students aren't oil,
Yeah.
but key connections. You know,
Pipeline, funnel,
exactly. So,
what other
to
huge,
in some
yeah.
ways, I
Mhm.
advise, take your mind. Those things are all shifting and changing. So get those metaphors out of your head and start to think about it in terms of match and connection and context. But
Nice.
those
Yeah.
examples that we give, India is a great one in which it's evolving very quickly, and the type of making sure that you acknowledge qualifications and credentials such as Cambridge AS levels, the 1 year coursework, because India is typically a 12-year system. Knowing the CBSE and other Indian board exams, and
Right.
seeing in that affordability conversation whether you can grant credit and placement, not just for A levels. And you certainly should be acknowledging IB as well, because that's very popular in that system. But really knowing these other qualifications and respecting, honoring them. And if you give credit for, say, AP, also giving credit, because that affects the affordability, but also sends a signal that you understand and you respect the context these students are coming from, and placing them up for success in those STEM area, particularly STEM areas, but not just STEM areas, in which they're not in those entry level coursework, but they're coming because they want to be challenged. So that's one way in which universities can start to meet international students where they
I
are,
love that.
particularly in that more dynamic South Asia context. But I would also say Vietnam, Sub Saharan Africa, you would have similarities.
Yeah, I love that kind of shift in thinking about, how are we building a pipeline to how are we making connections and how are we understanding the cultural context in which they operate. And, I can scream that from the rooftops, and I probably have gotten on my soapbox a few times about this topic about, not lumping them all, first of all, in the same category, and being more, when you look at corporate studies about how they are successful in international markets, it's about global, right? It's global and local. And how do we get that balance of having a global approach but localizing our efforts to those markets and to those economies and the ways in which they view education and higher education and the tests and things like that, and what are the pain points that they feel versus, again, it's hard to even again lump a whole country in that, but at least starting there is something that I wish we would do more of.
Absolutely. And there's good data out there. Common App, I'm really impressed by what their teams are doing to provide data domestically, but also internationally. And that's, one report that was generated by Common App shows that international students are among the least likely to provide what I would consider traditional or legacy bubble tests like ACT or SAT.
Mm,
Less than a third within Common App are submitting those types of tests, which is likely tied to that students aren't taking those tests as much, but also maybe they're not as confident that those particular foreign credentials represent them. That
right.
they would want to be represented by something else. So again, that signal of respect, but also just the reality that you're cutting off your market so much,
Yeah.
if only a third within Common App. And keep in mind that the UCs, the University of California system, the CSU, CUNY, a major system which does draw in, they aren't even in Common App. So that's not even the whole universe of students because UCs are test free. The numbers that are submitting tests internationally are likely much lower. And this rhymes with data in the US about first gen students, underrepresented
Mm-hmm.
students, female students,
Mm-hmm.
and low income students. So these often are priorities. And folks don't always link that students from underrepresented backgrounds or low income backgrounds or first gen backgrounds, especially those from immigrant families, that there's a connection between international students. Sometimes universities see
Right.
these populations being very different, but many times that adjustment and then that, you know, adjusting your outreach, customizing, as you said, making it global, making things meaningful,
Yeah.
about your core values, making it meaningful for those populations internationally are key.
Yeah. I mean, I just have a small example and then I'll move on to my next question. I mean, you know, English is the first language or predominantly the medium of instruction in India. And yet, for degrees in the US at the time, now I'm talking about 20 years ago, I'm glad things have changed, but TOEFL was required. And which is test of English as a foreign language. That's what that stands for our listeners. And it just felt that there could have been a localization component here that could have been applied that could have kind of reduced some of the barriers for students who wanted to pursue an education. Those tests are not cheap. Those tests for, and so it's like, is it just a checkbox? Is it actually something that you're assessing? Is it something that you need to assess, knowing that certain markets and certain countries are just, they just don't need English proficiency tests. And so I'll just I'm getting
I
some
agree with you,
flashbacks about.
and I've done projects with IELTS, so I don't, uh, and I really appreciate what IELTS does for many countries. But you're right, knowing that, say, in that example of India and other parts of South Asia, there's been an emergence of private international style schools whose medium of instruction is English. Now, local schools also will use English, but there is a distinction there. And if you're getting a diploma from an English medium instruction school, then asking for English proficiency, there's some discordance there, right? It sends the
Yeah,
wrong messages. So
yeah.
I completely agree.
Now, if they did an idiom test, I would definitely fail there, but I can
Right.
still converse in English. I just cannot get around things like skinning the cat or throwing the baby with the bathwater and things like that. I would be totally lost.
I would hope that would never be on a TOEFL or an IELTS.
I would be remiss if I didn't address where we are at this point in time. We have another election year coming up, and it is an election year that people will be watching closely. We referenced 2016 a little bit, and we referenced some political swings that kind of make things a little different for the international marketplace. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball, although pollers might disagree. what how do we best prepare for a year that could potentially change things for the international marketplace and particularly international higher education?
It's a great question, and one I want to take with sensitivity because things are changing very quickly. But but even what's going on now in news, but particularly how what's going on in campuses now are framed within global media
Right.
is something that we need to watch closely and be concerned about because perceptions of safety and welcomeness, we've talked about that before, but to me, that's the thread running through whether it's the upcoming elections, whether it's how administrations are working or treating students overall on during this era of student activism. Student activism is something that has a long history and be contextualized not just in the U.S. but many places outside the U.S. But parents and students are watching, and
Yes,
that perception of safety, of welcomeness, is key. Now,
absolutely.
currently, most international students in the US have clustered in particularly flagships and large publics, and but also larger privates, that are coastal, and then in the heartland, but particularly in the blue, I would say the bluer states. This has been the concentration of international students, at least blue states for now. Um, the South or the redder states have seen an uptick in international students. Um, Places like my alma mater, Vanderbilt, has done very well. When I went there back in the '90s, it was
Hmm.
just a handful of international students. My guess is less than 1%, maybe 2%. It's now surpassed double digits and
Interesting.
attracts those students very well. Universities like Duke and Rice. You've also seen some publics do well. Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech do well. I think they have more to be concerned about, because I think there is even terms like red and blue states, it might not be used internationally, but I think there is a sense that cities like LA, New York, San Francisco, these are welcome, immigrant friendly areas, and their
Yes.
universities, which have always done a good job. Northeastern, BU, NYU, GW down in DC and American, USC. They traditionally have welcomed many international students at scale. It's not that these changes won't impact them, but I suspect it will impact them less than other parts of the country.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's all fair. Well, we'll be paying a close attention on that, obviously, for a number of reasons, but including how the international landscape shakes out. But, thank you so much, Clay. I mean, like I said, we could talk for hours on what we're seeing happening in international education. And today we've just talked, maybe just done what is the idiom where we've touched the tip of the sphere? Is that what it is?
I like it. Let's go with that.
Some of these are a little violent, so I try to try to use them in the right context. But this is a lot to unpack. But if people want to pick your brain and learn more about international recruitment and really get into this topic further, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn at Clay Hensley, Twitter and Threads. those sort of things. But if someone wants to reach out and email me, I'm simply clayhensley@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you.
Well, thank you. So there you have it, Clay Hensley. Thank you so much for your time today. And I'm sure our listeners have taken a wealth of information and knowledge from our conversation. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
This Pulse Check mini-series has been brought to you by Pathify. Gone are the days of clunky interfaces, disjointed systems, and massive, unhelpful link farms. Centralize all your systems with Pathify so that students see the information that matters to them in a digital experience that actually makes sense. From prospective students through alumni, it's about time the student experience started looking and acting like a consumer app from this century. Visit pathify.com for more. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.